The listening lamp flickers to life, illuminating the space between worlds. Here, science whispers to spirit, and reality bends to imagination. Curl up in the cosmic glow as we unveil the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The Time Merchant, a short story written by Rob Corrigan, narrated by Christopher McLeod.
Marcus's shop appeared in the spaces people tried not to see. It nestled between a bookstore that had closed 30 years ago and a cafe that wouldn't open for another decade, its weathered sign swinging in winds that obeyed different seasons than the rest of the street. The window display changed according to laws of time rather than fashion. Victorian cameos aging into digital watches, then reverting to sundials, all in the space between one blink and the next. Inside, time moved like honey dripping from a spoon, thick and sweet and impossibly slow. Brass clockworks lined the walls, their hands moving in contradictory directions. Some tracked minutes that had already passed, others counted down to moments yet to come. The air smelled of oiled gears and forgotten spices, of dust that might have settled yesterday or a century ago. Marcus polished the counter with a cloth that had once been new, watching motes of displaced time drift in the amber light. The wood beneath his fingers had been polished by thousands of hands seeking bargains they didn't quite understand. He could feel their desperation in the grain, lovers wanting more time together, parents trying to reclaim lost moments with children, elderly souls desperate to relive their youth. The bell above the door chimed a note that existed somewhere between F-sharp and memory. An old man stood in the entrance, time hanging heavy in the creases of his face. His eyes carried the particular hunger Marcus had learned to recognize, the look of someone willing to trade what they had for what they'd lost. "Welcome," Marcus said, though they both knew the old man had been here before. Time had a way of folding in the shop, making every visit feel like both the first and the last. The old man approached the counter, his steps leaving ripples in the shop's temporal currents. He pulled an old pocket watch from his coat, handling it with the care reserved for holy things. "My retirement," he said, his voice thick with certainty. "All those quiet mornings, the peaceful afternoons, I want to trade them for one moment. Just one." Marcus held out his hand for the watch. The metal was warm, humming with accumulated contentment. Thousands of crossword puzzles solved in sunlit corners, countless cups of tea savoured in perfect solitude. A good retirement, well-earned and well-spent, worth quite a bit in trade. "The moment you want in return?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. There was always a moment people wanted back badly enough to trade their peace for. "Our first dance," the old man whispered, "at our wedding, before the cancer, before the children grew distant, before time did what time does. I want to hold her again, just for that one perfect moment when everything was possible." Marcus nodded, opening a drawer beneath the counter. Inside, glass bottles clinked against each other, each containing moments of varying quality. He selected one that glowed with the particular shade of possibility that all perfect moments possessed. The glass was warm against his palm, resonating with the sound of an orchestra playing The Way You Look Tonight, in a truly magnificent way. "A fair trade," Marcus said, "but remember, you can visit the moment, but you can't change it. What happened after will still have happened." The old man nodded, tears catching the shop's strange light. "I know, I just need to hold her again, to remember why it was all worth it." Marcus uncorked the bottle with practiced care. The moment escaped like perfume, wrapping around the old man in a gentle haze. For a brief eternity, years fell away from his face. His back straightened, his eyes brightened, and his hands reached out to embrace someone only he could see. They danced there in the shop, the old man and his memory, while Marcus carefully wound the pocket watch. Each turn of the key captured another peaceful morning, another quiet afternoon, storing them safely for someone else's future use. The weight of traded time settled into the shop's foundations, making the floorboards creak with accumulated moments. When the moment ended, the old man's youth drained away like water, but his eyes held a peace that hadn't been there before. He nodded once to Marcus and turned to leave, his steps lighter despite the weight of years returning to his shoulders. As the door closed behind him, Marcus felt the familiar ache begin. Someone else's wedding dance flickered at the edges of his memory. Had he ever been married? He thought he remembered a white dress, a different song, but the image slipped away like smoke, joining all the other memories he wasn't quite sure were his anymore. He placed the bottled retirement on a shelf behind the counter, where it would age properly before being traded again. The pocket watch went into a velvet-lined case with other timepieces of similar quality. Each contained someone's piece, bottled and preserved, waiting to be traded for more desperate moments. The clockworks on the walls continued their contradictory movements, marking time in directions that only made sense in the space between seconds. Outside, the world moved forward in its orderly progression from moment to moment. But in the shop, time pooled and eddied like water finding its own level, carrying memories like leaves in its current. Marcus found himself studying his reflection in a clouded mirror behind the counter. His face seemed uncertain, as if it couldn't quite decide how old it should be. Something tugged at his thoughts, a ledger he needed to check, a mystery that needed solving. But before he could grasp it, the bell chimed again, announcing another customer seeking to trade what they had for what they'd lost. He turned away from the mirror, pushing aside his unease to focus on the business of buying and selling time. The mystery would wait. In his shop, after all, time was the one thing they never ran out of. Or so he kept telling himself, even as another memory slipped quietly away. Morning arrived like a half-remembered dream, filtering through the shop's dusty windows in shades of amber and gold. Marcus watched the light crawl across the floorboards, noticing how it skipped certain planks as if those spaces belonged to different hours entirely. The clocks on the walls whispered contradictions: 6 a.m., midnight, dusk, dawn, their hands moving in patterns that felt both random and inevitable. His head ached with the particular pain of lost memories trying to surface. Last night's trade with the old man had stirred something loose in his mind, like a stone disturbing the silt at the bottom of a pond. He found himself reaching for memories of his own wedding, but instead caught fragments of 1,000 other ceremonies, white dresses that had never been worn, vows that had never been spoken, kisses that belonged to strangers. The ledger sat accusingly on his desk, its leather cover worn smooth by hands he was starting to suspect had all been his own. When he opened it, the pages released the scent of pressed flowers and old promises, the entries blurred before his eyes. June 15th, year smudged. Traded, 3 summers of childhood for 1 moment of forgiveness. October 31st, 1922. Traded, first love's kiss for an hour of peaceful passing. April 3rd, 1987. Traded, 20 years of accumulated sunrises for a single chance to say goodbye. His own handwriting evolved across the pages, from copperplate script to modern cursive, then back again. Some entries appeared to have been written tomorrow, the ink still wet with future tears. Marcus closed the ledger gently, but not before a loose photograph slipped from between its pages. The image showed a boy standing in front of what might have been his shop, though the street looked different. Horses instead of cars, gas lamps instead of electric lights. The boy's face was painfully familiar, but Marcus couldn't tell if he was looking at his own past or someone else's borrowed history. The shop's bell chimed a warning as reality rippled. A customer would be arriving soon. Time flowed differently around the shop's entrance, giving Marcus advance notice of visitors. He tucked the photograph back into the ledger, trying to ignore how the boy's eyes seemed to follow him with profound sadness. While waiting, he found himself drawn to a small wooden box he didn't remember acquiring. Inside, childhood memories clinked against each other like marbles. He lifted one to the light, a perfect summer afternoon captured in glass. The memory belonged to someone else, but as he held it, his own childhood tried to surface. There had been a tree, hadn't there? An old oak with a swing? Or had that been one of yesterday's trades? The bell chimed again, this time in the present, A young woman entered, carrying time in her arms like a burden. Marcus felt the weight of her grief before she reached the counter, recently widowed by the particular shade of darkness that clung to her shoulders. They all came, eventually, those left behind by death's final bargain. "I was told you could help," she said, her voice steady despite her pain. "That you trade in moments." Marcus nodded, his hands already moving to the shelf where he kept the gentler memories. "What would you like to trade?" "My future," she said simply. "All the years ahead of me, I want to trade them for one more day with him." The request sent a tremor through the shop's foundations. Future time was volatile, unstable. Trading it was dangerous. Marcus opened his mouth to explain this, but the words that came out belonged to a different conversation entirely. "I tried that once," he heard himself say. "Traded away my own future for—" The memory slipped away before he could grasp it, leaving only the taste of regret like copper on his tongue. The woman watched him with knowing eyes. "You don't remember what you traded it for, do you?" The question hit him like a physical blow. No, he realized. He didn't remember. Just as he didn't remember his childhood, or when he'd acquired the shop, or why some entries in the ledger were written in his hand decades before he could have possibly been born. "I can't make that trade," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Future time is too unstable. It would tear reality apart." He didn't add that he suspected he'd learned this lesson before, perhaps many times. The woman left without arguing, taking her grief and her dangerous desire with her. But her question lingered in the air like smoke, making the clockwork stutter in their endless dance. Marcus found himself back at the mirror, studying his reflection with growing unease. His face seemed to shift between moments, young, old, ageless, never quite settling into one truth. Had his eyes always been that shade of brown? He thought they might have been blue once, or green, or perhaps all colours at once. The photograph from the ledger burned in his pocket. He pulled it out again, laying it next to a bottle of preserved memories on the counter. The boy in the image smiled his knowing smile, standing in front of a shop that both was and wasn't the same place Marcus now occupied. A terrible suspicion began to take root. How many times had he stood here looking at this same photograph? How many times had he traded away his own memories, his own future, his own past? And more importantly, what could have been valuable enough to make him do it over and over again? Outside, the street continued its slow progression through ordinary time. Inside, Marcus felt the weight of accumulated trades pressing down on him like layers of sediment, burying whatever truth lay at the bottom of his existence. The clocks chimed discordantly, marking another hour that might have been yesterday or tomorrow or a century ago. Marcus carefully returned the photograph to its place in the ledger, knowing he would find it again when he needed to remember that he had forgotten. The bell above the door began its warning chime. Another customer approached, another trade waited to be made, another memory, perhaps, to lose. Marcus straightened his vest, pushed aside his doubts and prepared to do business. The mystery of his own past would wait. It always did. After all, in a shop that traded in time there was always more, until there wasn't. Time leaked from the seams of Marcus's shop like water from the cracked vase. Moments dripped from the ceiling, forming puddles of memory that reflected impossible skies. The clockworks on the walls had begun marking hours that never existed, their hands spinning through mathematical impossibilities. 13 o'clock, 0 hour, the time between breaths. Marcus felt the change in his bones. Each trade now left a residue, memories that weren't his own taking root in the fertile soil of his uncertainty. He caught himself humming lullabies in languages he'd never learned, mourning lovers he'd never met, celebrating victories he'd never won. A schoolteacher traded 30 years of lesson plans for one perfect moment when a failing student finally understood. As Marcus bottled her dedication, mathematical formulas wrote themselves across his consciousness. He found himself solving complex equations in the margins of the ledger, his handwriting matching entries from 1947. An old sailor exchanged his last storm at sea for a peaceful passing. The trade left salt on Marcus's tongue and the knowledge of how to navigate by stars he'd never seen. That night he dreamed of waves higher than mountains, and woke with rope-calloused hands that slowly faded back to smooth. A young mother traded her child's first steps for enough time to say goodbye at a hospital bedside. The exchange burned like fever in Marcus's blood, leaving him with the phantom weight of a toddler in his arms and tears he couldn't explain. The trades grew more complex as words spread through whatever channels carried such knowledge. People began asking for impossible exchanges, future possibilities for past certainties, hope for regret, truth for lies. Each transaction left its mark, until Marcus wasn't sure which memories belonged to him and which were borrowed. "I want to trade my regrets," a man insisted one grey afternoon, placing a box of dark crystals on the counter. Each one contained a moment of bitter recognition. Paths not taken, words not said. Regrets are unstable, Marcus heard himself say, though he couldn't remember learning this. They exist in multiple time streams at once. Trading them can fracture reality. The man leaned forward, desperation making him reckless. "I'll pay any price." Marcus felt time twist around them like a cat arching its back. "Others have said that," he murmured. I think I might have said it too." Later, after the man had gone, though whether he'd made the trade or not, Marcus couldn't quite remember, the mirror showed 3 different reflections at once. In one, Marcus was young, his eyes bright with purpose. In another, he was ancient, bent under the weight of accumulated years. In the third, he wasn't there at all, just an empty shop stretching into infinity. He found himself studying the ledger more frequently now, trying to piece together his own story from the fragments hidden between other people's trades. Certain entries caught his eye, their familiarity itching like splinters under skin. September 8th, year illegible. Traded, all memory of her for the certainty she lived. May 21st, 1899. Traded, the knowledge of what was saved for the ability to save it. Tomorrow, we'll trade everything to begin again. The last entry was written in his current handwriting, though he had no memory of making it. A woman came at twilight, carrying her grandfather's pocket watch. She wanted to trade his collected memories of World War II for a peaceful death. As Marcus completed the transaction, bullets whistled through his dreams and trenches carved themselves into his palms. He found himself humming a French resistance song while writing in the ledger, his fingers remembering the weight of a rifle that had never existed. The trades began to blur together, each one leaving something behind, a gesture, a phrase, a fear, a love. Marcus started finding objects he couldn't remember acquiring, a curved knife from ancient Persia, a computer disk from a future that hadn't happened yet, a marriage certificate dated 1856 that might have been his own. One morning he noticed the floorboards had begun to age backwards around his desk, the wood growing younger until pale saplings pushed through the cracks. That afternoon a customer's trade left him speaking in perfect Latin for an hour. By evening he had lived 3 different versions of the same day, each one true, each one impossible. The mirror cracked along mathematical lines, dividing his reflection into ever smaller fractions of possibility. Time poured through the fissures like light through a prism, splitting into components that hurt his eyes to witness. In quiet moments between trades, Marcus felt himself becoming unstable, as if he might dissolve into the accumulated time that filled his shop like fog. His memories rearranged themselves constantly, showing him childhoods he might have had, loves he might have lost, futures he might have traded away. The clockworks chimed in harmony for the first time in what might have been years, drawing his attention to the ledger. A new entry was writing itself in his hand, the ink still wet with possibility. Today, whenever that is, beginning to remember what I made myself forget. God help me when I remember why. Outside, the street aged and renewed itself with each passing car. Inside, Marcus turned the pages of the ledger with shaking hands, searching for the truth hidden in the spaces between trades. The bell above the door began its warning chime. Another customer approached, Another trade waited to be made, another piece of himself to lose or perhaps to find. Marcus straightened his jacket, which might have been new or ancient or yet to be woven, and prepared for business. The mystery of his own past pulled at him like gravity, but the work came first. It always had, it always would, it always must. The leather-bound book seemed to breathe in Marcus's hands, its pages expanding and contracting like lungs drawing air from different centuries. The ledger had grown heavier since morning, though he hadn't added any new entries. Its cover felt warm, almost feverish, as if the memories trapped inside were trying to escape. Rain fell outside the shop windows, each drop containing a different year. Through the warped glass, Marcus watched as pedestrians aged and grew young again, their umbrellas opening and closing like dark flowers blooming in time-lapse. The shop had begun to drift, its foundation slipping between moments like a boat coming loose from its moorings. He opened the ledger carefully, aware of how the pages had started to resist his touch. Tonight the entries seemed to arrange themselves in new patterns, forming constellations of meaning he'd previously missed. His own handwriting evolved and devolved across decades, sometimes changing mid-sentence. March 15th, 1876, first trade completed. Simple exchange of moments. The cost seems minimal. The ink grew darker, more recent. March 15th, 1877, the memories begin to blend. Customers' pasts seep into my dreams. The writing aged, turned formal. March 15th, 1888. Found evidence of previous cycles. How many times have I begun again? Marcus traced the words with trembling fingers. Each entry carried trace elements of the original trades. Sea spray from a sailor's last voyage, chalk dust from the teacher's final lesson, gunpowder from a soldier's forgotten war. The memories rose like steam, seeping into his skin, showing him fragments of lives he might have lived. A loose page slipped free, yellowed with age, yet somehow still wet with fresh ink. The handwriting matched his exactly, though the date was impossible. Final warning to myself. The trade you're considering will cost everything. The shop demands balance. For every moment saved, something must be lost. I've done this before, we've done this before. Trading away our memories to save. To save. The reason eludes me now. Perhaps that's mercy. But know this. There was purpose to our forgetting. There was love in our sacrifice. When you find this note again, remember that some prices are worth paying even if we can't remember why. The paper crumbled at his touch, dissolving into timestreams that flowed back into the ledger's binding. But the words remained, burning behind his eyes like an afterimage of the sun. He turned more pages, decades falling away like autumn leaves. Patterns emerged in the trades, cycles of loss and renewal, each spinning closer to some central truth he couldn't quite grasp. Certain dates repeated with fractal precision. November 9th, 1923. Everything changes today. The choice unmakes itself. November 9th, 1954. Found my own warning, starting again. November 9th, 1989. The wall falls, all walls fall, time bleeds. November 9th, 2021. Full circle now. The shop knows what it needs. As he read, memories that didn't belong to him began to surface. He remembered standing in this same spot 100 years ago, reading these same words, feeling this same vertigo of recognition. The shop groaned around him, its timbers expanding and contracting through centuries of weather. A photograph fluttered from between the pages, not the one of the boy this time, but something older. The edges were burnt, as if it had been rescued from a fire that might have happened tomorrow. Through the damage, he could make out a face that might have been his father, or himself, or someone he would become. The man stood in front of the shop holding a pocket watch, that Marcus suddenly remembered feeling in his own hand. The memory hit him like a physical blow, brass warm against his palm, the subtle click of the case opening, numbers that counted backwards toward some final moment. But when he reached for more detail, the recollection splintered into fragments of other people's pasts. Thunder rolled outside, the sound echoing strangely through the shop's accumulated decades. The clockworks on the walls began to chime out of sequence, marking hours that hadn't happened yet. Among their discordant music, Marcus heard patterns emerging, a countdown perhaps, or a warning. He turned to the ledger's final pages, where today's trades should be recorded. Instead, he found entries written in his hand but dated years ahead, describing exchanges he hadn't made yet. The ink was still wet, chronology bleeding across the paper. Tomorrow, or perhaps yesterday, found the ledger again, beginning to understand. Last week, relative to when. The cost increases, memory fragments into moments. Soon, everything comes full circle. The shop prepares for what must happen. Now, I remember. God help me, I remember everything. The last entry was writing itself as he watched, ink flowing across the page like black water. But before he could read the words taking shape, the mirror behind his desk shattered. Not into pieces, but into moments, each shard reflecting a different version of himself, a different choice, a different outcome. Marcus staggered back from the ledger, his mind overwhelmed by the weight of accumulated time. The shop seemed to pulse around him, its walls breathing in and out like bellows, forcing time through the cracks in reality. Outside, the rain had stopped falling upward, and the pedestrians had settled into their proper ages. But inside, everything was changing. The ledger's revelations had started something, triggered some mechanism that had been waiting to unwind. Marcus felt it in his bones, in the hollow spaces where his memories used to be. The bell above the door began to chime, but the sound was wrong. Instead of warning of a customer's approach, it seemed to be counting down. To what, he didn't know. Yet. The ledger lay open on his desk, waiting. In the fractured mirror behind it, 1,000 versions of himself looked back with eyes that knew too much or too little, or exactly enough. It was time to remember what he had chosen to forget. It was time to understand the true cost of keeping time's shop. It was time to learn why some prices were worth paying, even if the reason had been traded away. The mirror in Marcus's shop had begun to lie. Or perhaps, he thought, studying his reflection in the ancient glass, it had finally started telling the truth. His face shifted like smoke in water, sometimes young, sometimes old, occasionally belonging to a stranger who wore his eyes. The only constant was the growing hollowness in his gaze, as if something essential was slowly draining away. He turned from the mirror, his joints aching with accumulated years that weren't his own. The shop felt heavier today, its shelves bowing under the weight of traded moments stored in bottles and boxes. Each container held someone else's time, childhood summers preserved in mason jars, first kisses trapped in perfume bottles, grief sealed in dark glass vials. His own memories had become like water cupped in trembling hands, spilling away faster the tighter he tried to hold them. He knew he'd had a childhood, but the details slipped through the cracks in his mind. Had he grown up by the sea? He remembered salt air and crashing waves, but also mountain peaks and desert heat. Too many borrowed moments cluttering the spaces where his truth should be. The ledger lay open on his desk, its pages filled with entries in handwriting that changed from line to line. Some entries he recognized as his own current script, others appeared older, more formal. All were signed with his name. All documented trades he couldn't fully remember making. Yesterday, or was it last week? Last year? He'd found a photograph tucked between the ledger's pages. It showed him standing in front of the shop, but the date made no sense. 1887, when he couldn't be more than 40 now. Could he? The mirror offered no answers, only more questions in the form of shifting reflections. As twilight gathered in the shop's corners, Marcus began his desperate ritual. He developed a system methodically opening each container, hoping to find traces of his original memories mixed in with the traded moments. The process was dangerous. Exposure to raw time could age him decades in seconds, or reduce him to childhood in the space between heartbeats. A small blue bottle held someone's first bicycle ride. Marcus uncorked it carefully, letting the memory wash over him. Freedom and fear mingled with the scent of hot rubber and summer grass, his hands remembering handlebars that had never existed, knees stinging with phantom scrapes. But nothing of his own past surfaced in the borrowed moment. He moved faster now, growing reckless. A crystal decanter of wedding days, a tin box of bedtime stories, a wooden case containing carefully preserved last words. He opened them all, drowning himself in other people's histories. Each exposure left its mark. His hands withered and smoothed, wrinkled and strengthened. His hair greyed and darkened in waves, and somewhere distant clocks stuttered in their eternal march forward. In his desperate searching, he knocked over a small vial of dark glass. It shattered on the floor, releasing the scent of gunpowder and copper pennies. Someone's moment of deepest regret now loose in the air. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a phone call that should have been answered, a goodbye that should have been said, a truth that should have remained hidden. But not his regret. Never his own. As the foreign guilt faded, leaving him gasping, Marcus noticed a hairline crack spreading through the shop's reality. It started where the vial had shattered and crept outward, like ice forming on a window. Through it, he caught glimpses of other versions of his shop, other versions of himself. All of them searching, all of them losing pieces of themselves to time's endless hunger. The truth settled over him like dust in an abandoned room. He had done this before. How many times had he reached this point, driven by desperation to recover what he had lost? How many times had he tried to break the cycle, only to become part of it once again? His reflection watched him from the mirror, young and old and ageless all at once, the face of a man who had traded away his own past, perhaps to save something even more precious. But what? The answer lingered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue, like a name almost remembered. Outside the shop's windows, time flowed normally, carrying people past in their orderly progression from moment to moment. Inside, Marcus stood surrounded by the debris of his failed attempts to reclaim himself. The cracked reality slowly sealed itself, leaving only a faint scar in the air where it had split. He carefully swept up the shards of the broken vial, each piece reflecting a different version of his searching face. The spilled regret had already seeped into the floorboards, joining countless other moments absorbed by the shop over its impossible existence. As he worked, a terrible understanding began to dawn. Perhaps his memories weren't lost. Perhaps he had traded them away deliberately, accepting this half-life of eternal preservation to prevent something worse. The thought settled into his bones with the weight of truth, though he couldn't remember the choice itself. Night fell outside the shop windows, but time's light continued to leak from the countless containers of captured moments. Marcus sat at his desk, surrounded by other people's hours, and began to write in the ledger. His handwriting shifted as he wrote, matching older entries perfectly. The cycle continued, as it always had, as perhaps it always would. But now, at least, he understood the cost of keeping time shop, even if he couldn't remember why he'd chosen to pay it. Time had stopped flowing in the shop. The clockworks hung frozen mid-tick, their hands caught between moments like insects in amber. Dust motes suspended in the air traced mathematical patterns of choice and consequence, each particle a decision point spinning in the thick silence. Marcus stood before his collection of traded moments, each bottle and box containing fragments of lives bargained away. His reflection fractured across the shattered mirror behind him, some versions younger, some older, all wearing the same expression of terrible understanding. The ledger lay open on his desk, its final pages filled with warnings written in his own hand across centuries. He finally remembered everything. The knowledge sat in his chest like a burning coal, searing away the comfortable fog of uncertainty. Now he understood why he had chosen to forget, why he had traded away his own memories again and again. The truth was too heavy to carry through immortality. The shop had never been just a shop. It was a linchpin, a focal point where time gathered and pooled, seeking balance. Without it, without him, the weight of all those traded moments would collapse, burning holes through reality like acid through paper. Every exchange, every bargain, every desperate trade had to be maintained, curated, preserved. Someone had to remember, even if they chose to forget. Marcus moved with deliberate precision, selecting bottles from his collection. Each one contained a moment he had lived, though he hadn't known it until now. A first kiss that might have been his, a wedding dance he might have shared, a child's laughter that might have filled his home, memories he had traded away to maintain the shop's delicate equilibrium. The shop groaned around him, its timbers creaking as reality pressed against its walls. Outside, the street had begun to blur, different decades bleeding into each other like watercolours in rain. He had to work quickly now. The knowledge of what he was, of what the shop truly meant, was already causing temporal stress fractures. He arranged the bottles in a precise circle on his desk, each one aligned with entries in the ledger. The pattern was familiar. He had done this before, though those memories had been traded away too. How many times had he stood in this exact spot preparing to unmake himself? The mirror fragments showed him infinite versions of this moment, some where he failed, some where he succeeded, some where he chose not to try. But in every reflection, the shop remained. It had to remain. The alternative was unthinkable. Marcus opened the ledger to its final pages, where tomorrow's entries were still writing themselves. His pen felt heavy as he began to add his own words to the endless cycle. The shop must have a keeper. Time must have a guardian. Balance must be maintained. I choose this, knowing I will forget choosing it. I trade everything I am for everything that must be preserved. The cycle continues. The ink shimmered as it dried, each letter containing universes of possibility. Marcus uncorked the first bottle, releasing a memory of childhood. The moment swirled around him like smoke. Summer grass under bare feet, a mother's voice calling him home, the weight of a father's hand on his shoulder. He felt it dissolve, taking with it the certainty of who he had been. One by one he opened the bottles. Each memory escaped like a bird from a cage, carrying away another piece of his identity. First love, first heartbreak, the career he had dreamed of, the family he had planned, every joy, every sorrow, every moment that had made him himself, all traded away to maintain the shop's existence. The mirror fragments began to vibrate as temporal pressure built. In their depths, Marcus caught glimpses of other times, other places, other possibilities. A war that never happened, a peace that hadn't yet been won, a future balancing on the knife edge of now. His hands moved faster as reality trembled around him. The shop knew this dance. It had survived this transition countless times before. As each memory dissolved, the timbers settled, the foundation strengthened. The shop fed on forgotten moments, growing stronger as its keeper grew emptier. The final bottle contained the memory of why this sacrifice was necessary. Marcus held it up to the fractured light, seeing in its depths the catastrophe that had first necessitated the shop's creation. Time itself unwinding, reality crumbling, existence collapsing into chaos, all prevented by this endless cycle of trading and forgetting. "So be it," he whispered, and uncorked the bottle. The memory escaped like a scream, taking with it the last certainty of purpose. Marcus felt himself unravelling, becoming whoever the shop needed him to be. His reflection in the mirror fragments showed a stranger with familiar eyes, ready to begin again. Outside, time resumed its normal flow. The clocks began their eternal dance, marking moments that existed solely because he had chosen to forget they might not have. The ledger closed itself gently, waiting for the next cycle to begin. The bell above the door chimed its warning note. A customer was approaching. Someone with moments to trade, someone seeking the impossible. The shop settled around its new old keeper, ready to maintain the balance for another turn of the wheel. Marcus straightened his vest, adjusting to the weight of an existence he no longer remembered choosing. The ledger's warnings faded from his mind like writing in wet sand, leaving only the knowledge of procedure, of prices and trades, of maintaining equilibrium without understanding why. The door opened, time flowed, the cycle continued, and somewhere in the infinite reflections of the shattered mirror, a version of Marcus who remembered everything watched with profound sadness as another version of himself began to forget. The trade was complete, the shop was preserved, the keeper was renewed, until the next time, until every time, until time itself ran out. The shop settled into itself like an old house after a storm, its timbers creaking as centuries found their proper places again. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that seemed to arrive from different decades, each beam carrying the particular quality of light from years that might have been or never were. Marcus stood behind his counter, polishing a brass pocket watch with practiced care. His movements were sure, though he couldn't quite remember learning them. Everything felt both familiar and strange, like a dream half remembered upon waking. The mirror behind him had been repaired, though hairline cracks still traced patterns that looked almost like writing when viewed from certain angles. His reflection seemed uncertain, as if it couldn't quite decide who he was supposed to be. Sometimes, when he caught glimpses of himself in passing, he saw a stranger wearing his face with weary dignity. Time flowed differently now. He noticed it in small ways. How customers' voices reached his ears moments before they spoke, how objects left slight trails in the air, as if reluctant to commit to a single moment of existence. The clockworks on the walls had developed new habits, their hands moving in synchronized patterns that spelled out messages he almost understood. A small brass key lay on his desk, though he hadn't remembered placing it there. When he picked it up, it hummed against his palm with the weight of accumulated years. Something about it tugged at the empty spaces in his memory, places where knowledge had been that now held only echoes. The ledger sat nearby, its pages filled with entries in his handwriting, though he had no memory of making them. Some seemed to be written in ink that hadn't dried yet, recording trades he hadn't performed. Others appeared to be fading even as he read them, as if the moments they described were uncertain of their own existence. A woman entered the shop, bringing with her the scent of autumn leaves and remembrance. She moved carefully through the narrow aisles, studying bottles of captured time with the reverence of someone in a church. When she reached the counter, her eyes met his with an intensity that made him step back. "I've been here before," she said, though Marcus had no memory of her face. "The shop sees many customers," he replied automatically, the words feeling rehearsed, though he couldn't remember learning them. She smiled, sad and knowing. "But not many recognize it, do they? Not many remember trading away their memories." The key in his hand grew warmer. Around them, the shop's atmosphere thickened like honey about to crystallize. The clockworks slowed their endless dance as if holding their breath. "I don't," Marcus began, but the words scattered like startled birds. There was something about her eyes, something that sparked against the hollow places in his mind. "You traded everything," she said softly, over and over again, but some echoes remain, some memories refuse to be completely forgotten. She placed a small package wrapped in brown paper on the counter. It unfolded itself, revealing a collection of photographs that couldn't exist. Marcus in times and places he had never been, wearing expressions he didn't recognize, standing beside people he had never met. Yet each image sent ripples through his consciousness, like stones dropped into still water. The shop responded, its contents shifting subtly on their shelves. Bottles clinked against each other, their captured moments resonating with whatever truth the photographs contained. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. "Someone who chose to remember," she said. "Someone who keeps the memories you traded away, so not everything is lost." She touched one of the photographs gently. Someone who understands why the sacrifice was necessary. The key in his hand sang a single, pure note. The mirror's cracks caught the sound and transformed it into patterns of light that painted equations across the walls, the mathematics of memory and loss, of sacrifice and preservation. "I don't remember," Marcus said, his voice thick with the weight of forgotten things. "I don't remember any of it." "No," she agreed. "That's the price. That's always been the price." She gathered the photographs carefully, returning them to their wrapping. But the shop remembers, time remembers, and sometimes, in the spaces between moments, you remember too. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "It was worth it," she said quietly. "What you gave up, what you keep giving up, it was worth it." After she left, Marcus stood in the strange silence of his shop, holding a key that opened locks he couldn't remember, surrounded by times he might have lived. The ledger lay open beside him, its pages filled with warnings and promises written in his own hand across centuries. He couldn't remember what he had traded away. He couldn't remember why. But somehow, in the deepest part of himself where time flowed like blood through veins, he knew she was right. The shop creaked gently, settling around him like a well-worn coat. Outside, the street continued its orderly progression from moment to moment, protected by sacrifices it would never know about. Inside, Marcus returned to his duties, keeping time's books in a ledger that wrote itself, maintaining balances he no longer understood. The key found its place in his pocket, warm against his leg like a sleeping cat. The mirror's cracks caught light from impossible angles, turning it into memories that slipped away before he could grasp them. The clockworks resumed their eternal dance, marking time in a rhythm that felt like breathing. He was the keeper of moments, the guardian of time's integrity. He couldn't remember choosing this role, couldn't remember the price he'd paid to maintain it. But choice and memory were luxuries that belonged to other people now. People who lived in single moments, who moved forward in straight lines, who never had to trade away their certainty of self for the greater good. The bell above the door chimed its warning note. Another customer approached, another trade waited to be made. Marcus straightened his vest, adjusted his tie, and prepared to do business. The shop had work to do. Time had rules to follow. Memory had prices to pay. And he had chosen this even if he couldn't remember why. The seasons had begun to blur around the shop, winter frost crystallizing on windows that reflected summer heat, autumn leaves dancing past spring blossoms. Time had grown thin, transparent as tissue paper, showing the infinite layers of possibility that existed between each tick of the clockworks on the walls. Marcus stood at his desk, watching dust motes trace temporal eddies in the air. The ledger lay open before him, its pages now filling themselves without his intervention. Entries appeared and faded like breath on cold glass, recording trades that might happen, had happened, would never happen. The mirror behind him had healed itself, though its surface remained strange, more like still water than glass, reflecting moments instead of light. In its depths, he sometimes caught glimpses of other versions of himself, their faces bearing expressions he couldn't quite interpret. The brass key had become a constant presence in his pocket, its weight shifting with each trade he completed. Sometimes it felt light as a feather, other times heavy enough to bend time itself around its presence. He had stopped trying to understand its purpose, accepting it as he had accepted so many inexplicable aspects of his existence. A child's laughter echoed through the shop, though no children were present. The sound rippled across bottles of captured time, making them resonate like wine glasses stroked by wet fingers. Each note carried fragments of memory, a swing set creaking in summer wind, the smell of fresh-cut grass, a woman's voice calling a name he almost recognized. The bell above the door chimed its familiar warning, but the sound was different, older somehow, as if it was remembering all the times it had rung before. Marcus looked up to find a young man standing in the entrance, carrying time in his hands like a gift. Something about the visitor made the key in Marcus's pocket grow warm. The stranger moved through the shop with careful precision, as if he knew exactly where everything belonged. When he reached the counter, his eyes met Marcus's with an unsettling familiarity. "I've come to make a trade," the young man said, his voice carrying echoes of other voices, other times. "The shop is always open for business," Marcus replied automatically, though the words felt strange in his mouth. "What would you like to trade?" The young man placed an old pocket watch on the counter. Its case was worn smooth by handling, its face showing numbers that counted backwards toward some impossible hour. "I want to trade the certainty of what I am for the possibility of what I might become." The key in Marcus's pocket began to sing a single, pure note. The mirror rippled like wind across water, showing reflections of trades made centuries ago, trades yet to be made, trades happening in parallel moments that stretched into infinity. "That's a complicated trade," Marcus heard himself say, though the words seemed to come from somewhere else, some other version of himself who remembered why such trades mattered. The price would be considerable. "I know," the young man smiled, sad and knowing. "I've paid it before." The shop grew still, time holding its breath. The clockworks froze mid-tick, their hands pointing to hours that existed only in theory. Dust motes hung suspended in the air, forming patterns that looked like writing in a language Marcus had forgotten how to read. Understanding bloomed like frost across glass. The young man wasn't just a customer. He was Marcus himself, from before, from after, from always. This moment wasn't just a trade, it was a renewal, a continuation, a necessary loop in time's endless dance. The ledger's pages began to turn on their own, showing entries that stretched backwards and forwards through centuries. Each one recorded this same trade, this same moment, this same choice to forget in order to preserve. "You're me," Marcus said softly, the words carrying the weight of infinite repetition. "I am," the younger Marcus nodded, "and you are who I will become, who I have always become, who I must become again." The key in Marcus's pocket grew hot enough to burn. He pulled it out, watching as it transformed in his hand, becoming younger, older, possible, impossible. The mirror behind him showed the truth of all his lives, all his choices, all his sacrifices. "The shop must have a keeper," they said together, their voices harmonizing across time itself. The trade was both simple and profound. The younger Marcus would take his place, becoming the shopkeeper, trading away his memories to maintain time's delicate balance. And he would become something else, something he couldn't remember being but had always been. As the exchange completed itself, reality shifted like cards being shuffled. Marcus felt himself changing, becoming uncertain, becoming possible. The shop adjusted around them, accepting its new keeper while releasing its old one into the flow of time. The younger Marcus took his place behind the counter, the weight of duty settling onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. The key found its way into his pocket, warm and waiting. The ledger turned to a fresh page, ready to record new trades, new choices, new sacrifices. And the older Marcus? He stepped out into the street that existed between moments, carrying with him all the possibilities he had traded away. The shop door closed behind him with a sound like time itself sighing. Inside, the new keeper straightened his vest, adjusted his tie, and prepared for business. The clockworks resumed their eternal dance, marking hours that existed only in the space between seconds. The mirror settled, showing a single reflection. For now. The bell chimed its warning note. A customer approached, carrying time in their hands like water, seeking trades that would ripple through reality. The shop had work to do. Outside, sometime, everywhere, Marcus walked through streets that remembered all their possibilities. The key in his pocket had become something else, a story, perhaps, or a memory, or a promise. He couldn't remember exactly what he had traded, or why, but he knew with profound certainty that it had been worth it. It would always be worth it. It had always been worth it. It would be worth it again. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. Time flowed, trades were made, memories were lost and found and traded again. And in the shop that existed between moments, a keeper who was both new and eternal, prepared to maintain the balance for another turn of the wheel, until the next time, until every time, until time itself remembered how to dream.
Thank you for illuminating your imagination with the listening lamp. If our tale has sparked a light in your mind, we invite you to keep that flame burning. Subscribe to our podcast and join us again as we continue to explore the vast cosmos of human experience. Until next time, may your inner light guide you through the mysteries that await.